Welcome to the Digestive System lecture. This is not going to be a very long one, but there are a good number of details, and I will let you know which illustrations will be on your next lab practical. So first off, the functions of the digestive system include ingesting the food, meaning putting it in your mouth, then breaking down the food using two methods. So one method would be physically pulverizing it using your teeth, and another method would be using chemicals to actually break down the food particles. Once you actually break it down physically, then you're going to move it into the small intestine to absorb the nutrients into your blood. And then once you're done with that, then you get rid of the remaining food as feces through the rectum. So let's just look at the pathway food takes. You ingest it in your mouth. In the mouth, you have your teeth. The teeth crunch the food, and that's called mechanical digestion. This is a very important term for you. Remember that you're not going to be having an open book exam for any more of the exams, so I hope that you are taking notes on what I say is important. So mechanical digestion, this is an important term for you to know. So the teeth do some mechanical digestion, and then you swallow the food down the pharynx, through the esophagus, and when it goes down the esophagus, it ends up making its way down to the stomach. And in the stomach is where you churn the food further and you come into contact with acid, which is able to kill a lot of the bacteria and viruses that you've ingested. It's in this area that you begin more of what's called chemical digestion because there are chemicals in the gastric juices. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. And once you're done in the stomach, you make your way into the small intestine and the large intestine. Biggest difference between these two lengths of intestine is that the purpose of the small intestine is to do something called absorption. This is where all the nutrients that you broke down gets absorbed into your blood circulation. In the large intestine, the main thing that's happening here is water absorption. This is how you turn more watery feces into more compact feces before what's called defecation. So the alimentary canal is the canal that's a continuous opening from the mouth all the way to the anus, and it's covered with smooth muscle, and that smooth muscle is able to contract to push the food forward through the mouth, then the esophagus to the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and then your colon and the anus. Now, attached onto the alimentary canal are organs that we call accessory organs. And these organs include things like the gallbladder, the liver, any kind of salivary or mucus glands, and the pancreas. We'll talk about all of these organs and their functions as we move along. So the overall illustration you see here, this is a good one to put on a lab exam. So make sure that you go over this one and use the list that is posted under the module. We start off at the mouth. Go through the pharynx, then the esophagus, which turns and opens into the stomach. From the stomach, you go through the small intestine. Small intestine converges and becomes the large intestine. You go up the ascending colon. We use the word colon. It's interchangeable with intestine. Through the transverse colon, down the descending colon, loop around the sigmoid colon, and out the rectum and the anus. The accessory organs that you see are going to be the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas here. And hiding in the back right on the side is the spleen. So the digestive process is made out of a few major points, and that's going to be ingestion, propulsion, mechanical and chemical digestion, absorption, and defecation. So the ingestion happens in the mouth where you do your mechanical digestion. And mechanical digestion is going to be a physical breakdown of food. So an example would be you cutting up your steak is a way of mechanically breaking something down. Or you chewing a piece of meat to physically break it down. That's mechanical digestion. Once you swallow it, the smooth muscle in your esophagus takes over and it does something called propulsion. Now there's a word on here that I need you to underline, and that's peristalsis. Peristalsis is the smooth muscle contractions that take place in a wave-like motion to push the food that you eat from the top of the esophagus all the way down. Otherwise, it's like trying to get a kidney bean through a regular sized straw. It's very, very tight fit. So by pushing it down, you're able to move it through the esophagus and into the stomach, where you're going to keep doing mechanical digestion with the churning of the stomach. And again, it's because it's covered in smooth muscle. And the chemical digestion because you have enzymes in here, which we will briefly touch on, but that's mostly physiology. From the stomach, the food continues using peristalsis through the small intestine. And the main thing that happens here, again, is absorption. That means absorbing the nutrients into your blood to travel around your body. And at the end of it, we go into the large intestine, and what mainly happens here is, again, absorption, but not of nutrients, of water. This is how you get your feces to be compact. You reabsorb all the fluids from it, and it creates a compact feces that comes out of the anus. If you were not able to do this water absorption, it would actually cause something that you all know as diarrhea. So, we'll start at the top and work our way to the bottom. We're going to start at the mouth, and we don't call the mouth the mouth. The anatomically correct name for this is the buccal or the oral cavity. And these guys are all interchangeable. You can use either word on the lab exam. I will allow multiple answers. But the key thing here is that they're lined with stratified squamous epithelium. Now, we usually talk about simple squamous epithelium, but this is stratified. There's many layers in here, and you better hope there's many layers of epithelium in your mouth because the foods that you eat can be pretty rough sometimes or hot, and they can damage the first few layers that are found in that cavity. The vestibule is the opening that's found between the cheeks and the lips. This is where you usually store your food before swallowing it. Lips, again, are what line the vestibule. They do not possess any sweat or oil glands because you definitely do not want these to be slippery. And then the palate, if you remember talking about bones, you had the hard palate, which was found on the roof of the mouth. This is just simply called the palate. It helps to provide a rigid structure to push that food up and back towards the pharynx. So anatomically, here are the structures. This is a great illustration to use for the lab practical. Some key things here is mouth, the tongue, which is a very strong muscle, skeletal muscle. We move our way to the back. We have this little piece of tissue sticking down right here, and on this illustration is here. This is called the uvula. This is not a tonsil. The tonsils are found on the left and right sides of the opening. You do have 4 sets of tonsils. In this illustration, you only see the palatine tonsil here and here. And in this mid-sagittal view, the palatine tonsil is going to be right over here. So now this is where it gets kind of tricky. Let's say you're chewing food. Your tongue pushes it back. You go to the pharynx. And from the pharynx, you make your way down. At this point right here, the food has 2 options. Either move to the front and go down the trachea, or stay in the back and go down the esophagus. Now, where does the trachea send items to? Trachea goes down to the lungs. Do you want food to be going down to your lungs? Nope, that would be called choking. The food is going to stay in the back, and it's going to go down the esophagus. Now, again, look at how tight of a fit this is. So, again, this is covered with smooth muscle so that you can push that food down. Back to this illustration, we covered the uvula, we covered the palatine tonsils, you have the tongue, you've got the teeth, this space in between the gums and the lips, this is the vestibule. And then if you lift the tongue up underneath it, I know it's not labeled here and it's not on the practical, but this is kind of cool. These are your salivary ducts. This is why when you see something sour like a lemon or a Sour Patch Kid, you feel your mouth salivating. And one of the places you salivate from is going to be under your tongue because the opening is right there. Now that we're talking about the tongue, let's focus on this just a little bit. The tongue is covered with these little dots. These dots, a lot of people think that they're taste buds, and they are not. They're called papilla. You've got little dots all on the base of the tongue, and if you look at the back of the tongue, you can actually see these in the mirror. If you open your mouth and stick your tongue out really long, you'll see a single row of really big circles on the back or the base of the tongue. These particular papilla are larger than these papilla, and there's a reason. There are 3 papilla I want you to know about, and let's go through each of them now. On the majority in the body of the tongue, you have fungiform papilla and filiform papilla. The fungiform papilla are found dispersed evenly throughout your tongue, and these guys have a lot of taste buds on them, maybe 2 to 5 taste buds per papilla. The filiform papilla, again, are found all along the body of your tongue, but the job of these guys is not for taste buds, but instead it's for texture and roughness. In the back of the tongue, there's a circumvallate papilla, and the circumvallate papilla, these guys are much larger, which means they have about 150 to 250 taste buds each. You have your largest sensation of taste back here. And then the last thing on this is this word, bolus. Make sure you know this word. This word is defined as when you finally chew the food up and it's covered with saliva and it's in a ball. That is called the bolus. So if I go back a slide, you chew the food up here, cover it with saliva, and the minute it gets pushed to the pharynx, at that point it is called a bolus. It's going to be called a bolus and not food until we get down to the stomach. So we're at the salivary glands now, and the salivary glands are found all around your mouth. And again, their purpose is, like the name states, to provide saliva. So the main purposes of saliva is to clean your mouth. It is able to dissolve the food chemicals that you eat so that you can actually taste them. It makes the food compacted into a bolus, because remember, this term means food plus saliva compacted together by your tongue. Saliva, it's also really special because it actually contains some chemicals. So I told you already that the mouth is the place where we start mechanical digestion by chewing of the teeth and breaking down the food physically. But what I didn't tell you yet is in the mouth, we also do chemical digestion. And with what? Well, there's an enzyme called salivary amylase. This enzyme, it's amylase found in the saliva. And the point of all amylase, this enzyme, is to break down starches. Starches are complex forms of carbohydrates. Their basic form is the sugar. So with that being said, saliva is made up mostly of water. It has a neutral pH. It has some salt inside of it. It does contain mucin to make it nice and lubricated and sticky to create that bolus. And it has salivary amylase inside of it to begin chemical digestion of starches. So it's safe to say that in the mouth, we do both mechanical and chemical digestion. There are 3 salivary glands in your mouth, and they're located, and they kind of look a little bit like fatty material, like adipose tissue, but it is definitely not adipose tissue. And the 3 are the parotid gland, the submandibular gland, and the sublingual gland. If you notice, all 3 of these glands are connected with ducts that open up like straws into the mouth, and that's where you are able to disperse the saliva in the mouth. The function of all 3 is the same. They all produce saliva at the same time. It's just how much saliva they're producing that's different. Oh, I forgot to tell you. This picture, important for the lab exam. So far you put the food in your mouth, you chewed it, you turned it into a bolus, you started some chemical digestion with saliva, and then you pushed it to the back of your mouth, and it's going to start entering the pharynx and esophagus at this point. So let's assume you went past the esophagus and now you're entering, let's assume you went past the pharynx and now you're entering into the esophagus. The esophagus is entirely covered with muscle. The upper third of the esophagus is covered with skeletal muscle, which means it's voluntary. And the lower third is covered with smooth muscle, which means it's involuntary. It is this smooth muscle that does the peristalsis. Remember, the wave-like contractions of smooth muscle that allow us to push food down towards the stomach. All along the esophagus, you're also going to have glands that produce mucus. This acts like a lubricant because remember, the analogy that I gave is that getting food down the esophagus is almost like pushing a kidney bean through a straw. To get that kidney bean through the straw, it'll be helpful to number 1, push it or force it through the straw, which is peristalsis, and number 2, to lubricate the inside of the straw to make it easier to push that kidney bean through. Now, at the top and bottom of the esophagus, you have what's called sphincters. And sphincters are round muscular structures that can open and close the openings or the endings of the esophagus. The top sphincter is called the esophageal sphincter. This is going to prevent backflow of bolus from esophagus back into your mouth, because once you swallow it, you want to keep it in the esophagus. The one at the bottom of the esophagus is called the cardiac sphincter. It has nothing to do with the heart except for that it is behind the heart. So location-wise, it's behind the heart, so they called it the cardiac sphincter. But again, this is a sphincter or an opening and closing doorway that is able to prevent backflow back into the esophagus from the stomach. So once food goes from mouth into the esophagus, the esophageal sphincter closes. Then once food goes from the esophagus to the stomach, the cardiac sphincter closes. So once that food drops into the stomach, you definitely don't want it coming back into the esophagus because it'll burn the internal lining of that esophagus. So here you see the esophagus and the stomach, and the peristaltic contraction seems like a wave-like contraction, and it's done by the smooth muscle. It helps push the bolus down into the stomach. And right over here is where you would have your cardiac sphincter. But I do want to point out that a lot of textbooks and online sources also use the term gastroesophageal sphincter. This term and the term cardiac sphincter are interchangeable. So you could use both on the exam and it would be fine. So a bit of a review. You ingest the food. You can mechanically digest the food and chemically digest the food in the mouth. You can initiate propulsion, and you do what's called mastication. That is a fancy word for chewing. And all of this is done with the help of a very strong muscle called the tongue. Once you're done chewing the food, your tongue pushes that food to the back of your mouth, and that's called the pharyngeal process. We have a term called deglutition. This is just a fancy word for swallowing. So again, fancy word for chewing is mastication. Fancy word for swallowing is deglutition. That process is voluntary in the mouth, and then it's involuntary once you push the food further back and it goes into the pharynx/esophageal region. So again, voluntary places have skeletal muscle. Involuntary places have smooth muscle. So as you're pushing the food to the back of your throat, that's going to be the buccal phase. Once that food gets past a certain threshold and starts entering the pharynx and esophagus, that's the involuntary pharyngeal esophageal phase. After you pass this region, you're going to go strictly into the esophageal process. And that's going to be in the esophagus that's covered with mostly smooth muscle to begin our peristaltic contractions to push that thick bolus of food from the top of the esophagus down to the bottom. So at this point, we've gone to right over here. This would be kind of where that cardiac sphincter is. Once this cardiac sphincter opens, the bolus of food will drop into the stomach. Now, what's not drawn in this stomach here, this is the internal portion, is the stomach acid. That would be like a pool of fluid sitting down there. So once the bolus drops into the stomach, at that point, you do not call it bolus anymore. Here's your new term. It is called chyme. So chyme is the mixture of bolus plus stomach acid. Important term for you to know. Now, in terms of the anatomy here, let's list the regions of the stomach first. So like this dome up here is called the fundus. The entryway is called the cardia. The majority of the stomach is called the body. And the end of the stomach is called the pyloric region. So again, cardia, fundus, body, and fundic region. Sorry, pyloric region. Now, the stomach is covered with 3 layers of muscle, and this is going to be smooth muscle. How do I know it's smooth muscle? Well, because remember, there's only 3 types of muscle: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Why can this not be skeletal muscle? Think about that just for a moment. Why can the muscle covering the stomach not be skeletal muscle? Well, because one fact you know about skeletal muscle is that it is voluntary. Can you voluntarily contract your muscle in the stomach? No. Why can this not be cardiac muscle? Well, because we know the only place cardiac muscle is found is in the heart. So we're left with one muscle, and that's smooth muscle. It is involuntary, and in the stomach it's found in 3 different layers. And if you notice, there are 3 different orientations. So you have this orientation going up and down here. That's going to be this layer here. Underneath it, you have another layer going this way. And below that, you have another layer going diagonal. They all have different names. This is called the longitudinal layer because if I kept following it, it would go down in this orientation. Underneath it, this is called the circular layer because it circles around the stomach. The diagonal layer goes from here down that way and all the way across. That's called the oblique layer. So all 3 layers stack and they all work, and their purpose of being in all 3 orientations is to churn the food in different orientations. The more we can churn the food, the better we can break it down mechanically. So these muscles literally churn that food, contract and mix, and that food ends up getting rubbed against the inner lining. You see how these ridges are found inside the stomach? It almost acts like a washboard, giving like a friction-like surface to help physically break down the food. These ridges are called rugae. They're called rugae. We're not going to talk a lot about rugae or the production of acid. That'll be all for physiology. But for right now, you just learn the anatomy. So we talked about the different portions of the stomach, the different layers of tissue, the ridges called rugae. And the last thing I want to, again, remind you is that you have sphincters that open and close doorways to enter and exit each digestive organ. You definitely need to keep these regions distinct because you don't want things like acid mixing up into your esophagus or down into your small intestine. So the sphincter up here, cardiac sphincter. Now the new sphincter you haven't learned about yet is the sphincter at the end of the stomach, and this is called the pyloric sphincter, which makes sense because it's in the pyloric region of the stomach. So the pyloric sphincter is here, and it opens and closes to only allow small portions of chyme to go from the stomach into the small intestine. You don't want a whole water load of acidic chyme to go into the small intestine at one time because it'll definitely burn the inner wall of the small intestine. Again, acid needs to be contained in specific regions, and the only region in your body that's able to contain acid at a pH of like 1 or 2 is the stomach. So a little bit of physiology here. There are 3 phases that happen in the stomach. The first phase is the cephalic phase. This is when you're just thinking about food. You haven't even eaten it yet. It hasn't even gone to the stomach yet. The cephalic phase, cephalic means head, so the head phase. This is when you're just thinking about food and your thought process is so strong that it can already send signals to the stomach to start telling it to make more acid, more enzymes, and to start churning already. So it's preparing the stomach. Once you eat the food, you swallow it, it drops into the stomach. That's called the gastric phase. Anytime you see the word gastric or gastro, you have to think stomach. Like gastric bypass surgery, it's surgery that clips the stomach. So the gastric phase, this is when food is finally in the stomach. And when food is in the stomach, 2 major things happen. Number 1, of course, your stomach stretches out because now there's food in it. Number 2, the overall pH of your stomach rises slightly. Why is that? Well, because normally the pH of the stomach is around 1 or 2. The pH of the food that you eat is around like 5 or 6. So naturally, when you eat food and it drops into your stomach, it's going to raise the pH. So stretching of the stomach and increasing the pH of the stomach are both signals that are going to begin the gastric phase. What's really happening here is that now you're really churning and you're really contracting those muscles we talked about to start mixing the food and mixing it all in the stomach. Once we've pushed the food from the stomach into the intestines, we go into the intestinal phase. So from the stomach, when that chyme enters into the intestines will notice a drop in the pH inside of them. Why? Well, because now they just received acidic chyme from the stomach. Remember, in the stomach, this is a pH of like 1 or 2. Even if food enters, the pH will go up to like 2 or 3. Anything in the esophagus is neutral. Anything in the small intestine is slightly basic, in fact. So when food from here that's acidic, and it's called chyme, goes into the duodenum, which is the small intestine, that small intestine is going to sense, it's going to feel the presence of acidic chyme inside of it. So the presence of the acidic chyme, the low pH, is what's going to activate the intestinal phase. So when acid enters into your intestine, that is the signal to the intestine to say, hey, intestines, it's time to churn now. And the intestines will start contracting and further mixing your food. But really what the intestines do is they break down the food all the way and they absorb the food into your blood. So movement of chyme in the stomach is pretty similar to everywhere else. You do have the wave-like motions of peristalsis pushing that chyme down toward the pyloric sphincter. And eventually that pyloric sphincter is going to open slightly, and it's going to allow very small amounts of acidic chyme to enter into the duodenum. Again, remember, the duodenum has a slightly basic pH. He loves being at a higher pH. When you introduce acid into his environment, he's going to be kind of uncomfortable. So what we do to help him out is we only let in about 3 milliliters of chyme at a time to help neutralize this pH very slowly. Once this 3 milliliters goes through and passes down, then the sphincter will open up again and allow another 3 milliliters. This whole process could take up to 45 minutes. So it just depends on your digestive system, how yours functions, which is going to determine how quickly chyme will leave the stomach and enter into the small intestine. So small intestine is where we're at now. So we went from the esophagus to the stomach, and now we're going to the small intestine. The small intestine is made up of 3 regions. One is called the duodenum. That's the first region. Second region, the jejunum. And the last extension of it is called the ileum. This is probably one of the most important regions in digestion. The term digestion, by the way, if you haven't caught on to it yet, means the breakdown of food. It does not mean you're absorbing the food into your body. It just means the breakdown of food. So the duodenum is the first part of the small intestine that receives the acidic chyme, and this is the place that also connects to the pancreas and your gallbladder. So this is where we're going to receive the chyme. We're going to receive all the pancreatic enzymes. We're going to receive bile from the gallbladder. All of that's going to mix together here, and we're really going to start digesting the foods into smaller and smaller pieces. Once those tiny pieces of nutrients are produced, they go into the jejunum, and in the jejunum primarily is where you have a ton of blood supply, which means this is really where you're doing a lot of the absorption. And again, the term absorption means you're going to be taking the nutrients from the digestive system and absorbing it into your blood circulation. The ileum is also going to be where we do a lot of absorption, but in this area, you're going to find a lot of immune system cells. I don't think we talk about that here. Yeah, we don't. But just as a note to you guys, the ileum is where you're going to find these lymph nodes we call Peyer's patches. And those guys are going to contain immune system cells to keep breaking down or killing any kind of pathogen that made its way into the intestines. So let me go back a slide. You see the stomach here? The stomach goes into the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum. The duodenum, you see that the liver and the gallbladder connect at the duodenum. And the pancreas, this yellow organ, also connects the duodenum. So right now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas and give you their functions so you know how important they are. So in a real human, this would be the liver. And behind it, you see this little nugget that's sticking out? That little tip is the tip of the gallbladder. In reality, the gallbladder would probably sit like right over there. It's behind the liver. It's hiding behind it. So what is the function of the liver? This is the largest internal organ you have, and it is very heavy. His job is to make cholesterol and regulate cholesterol. His other major job in digestion is to make bile. Bile's job is to do something called emulsify the fat. This means take a big glob of fat and break it into tiny little globules of fat. It makes it easier to digest. It also removes drugs and hormones from your blood circulation, and it works with the gallbladder to store the bile. So the liver, this guy makes the bile, but the gallbladder stores the bile. So major differences. So liver makes your bile, and it gives it to the gallbladder to store the bile. The next organ is the pancreas. Here's your pancreas, it's a cartoon. The pancreas has two different types of cells that make it up. One is called acinar cells, and these guys make what's called pancreatic juices. Go ahead and connect this first bullet point down to the third bullet point. So this tells you what pancreatic juices are. Pancreatic juices made by the acinar cells are all of the juices and enzymes required for all the digestion in the duodenum. Sodium bicarbonate, next to this, write the word buffer. We know that buffers are there to help balance your pH. Proteases, these guys are enzymes that break down proteins into smaller amino acids. Pancreatic amylase, this is going to be an enzyme that works the same way as the salivary amylase did. Do you remember what amylase breaks down? It breaks down starches. So amylase in the mouth will break down starches in the mouth. Amylase in the pancreas, same exact job. Break down starches that are going to be going into the duodenum. Pancreatic lipase, this breaks down lipids, and pancreatic nucleases will break down DNA and RNA from the foods that you ate. The second type of cell in the pancreas that we're not going to really talk about is the islets of Langerhans cells. These are the cells in the pancreas that are your endocrine cells. They make insulin and glucagon. Do we know what insulin helps regulate in your body? We do. It's sugar. So insulin is a word we hear a lot with people with diabetes. So for those of us who cannot balance sugar, sometimes it can be an issue of insulin production. So insulin helps with blood sugar balance, as does glucagon. These two hormones work together so that your sugar levels aren't too high or that they're not too low. All right, important picture, my friends. Very important picture. This shows the pancreas, the gallbladder, and the duodenum. The gallbladder is able to connect to the pancreas using what's called the bile duct, that's in green, and the pancreas can connect to the duodenum using what's called the pancreatic duct, which is here. The big one is called the main pancreatic duct, and the little baby one that branches off is called the accessory pancreatic duct. If you see all of these circular like rings, those are all sphincters. You can open and close them to regulate how much bile and how much pancreatic juice to allow to go into the duodenum. So do you remember what organ connects to the first part of the duodenum? It would be sitting right over here. It's not the one that sits on top of the gallbladder, which would be the liver. It is the stomach. So if I can use my little pen, we can kind of continue to draw this. So here's that. Here's your esophagus, and then here's the stomach. We've got the fundus, and then we've got the body. There's that. So that's your stomach. Put an S in there. And then sitting on top of this guy is going to be your liver. What's your liver? So this is what it would look like. So esophagus to the stomach, stomach to the small intestine, and this portion of the small intestine is called the duodenum. And then you have the liver that makes bile. It stores the bile in here, so it'll store it all in here, and it secretes it out into the duodenum, as does all the pancreatic juices into the duodenum. So this is going to be the PowerPoint that gives you as much physio as you need to know. All these steps are customized to you guys and this class. So again, we have the liver, the gallbladder, the stomach, and the duodenum. Here's that pancreatic sphincter, the pyloric sphincter, and it controls how much chyme goes from the stomach into the duodenum of the small intestine. So up here would be the cardiac sphincter. Down here is the pyloric sphincter. So what's happening here is that as chyme enters into the duodenum, it stimulates this duodenum because it's the presence of acid now in the duodenum. What pH does the small intestine normally like to be at? It likes to be at a higher pH, which means it's basic. So because the acidity is entering into the duodenum, it's going to cause the cells that are lining the duodenum, called enteroendocrine cells, to release different hormones. In this case, we have red and blue. One of them is secretin, and the other one is CCK. So CCK is cholecystokinin, and secretin we just call secretin itself. Secretin and CCK get released out from the enteroendocrine cells in the presence of chyme, and they enter into your blood circulation. Main jobs of these guys. CCK is going to actually go into the blood, travel around, and when it gets to the pancreas, CCK tells the pancreas to start making a lot of pancreatic juices. So basically it says, hey, we just received a lot of acidic chyme into here. You're going to need to make a lot of juices to secrete it out and start breaking down that chyme. Because remember, the ingredients in the pancreatic juices include all of the enzymes that are going to keep digesting the food that's going to be coming through the stomach and entering into the duodenum. The secretin is going to have another job in and of itself. It's also going to go to the pancreas, which I think is the only thing I don't like about this picture, is that it's showing all these red dots kind of just chilling around here. But the secretin also goes to the pancreas, and it signals the pancreas to make bicarbonate. Now, what word did I have you write next to sodium bicarbonate in the pancreatic juices section? I had you write down the word buffer. The pancreas makes sodium bicarbonate, and sodium bicarbonate is the buffer that gets secreted into the duodenum to help neutralize the pH in here. Otherwise, this acidic chyme would definitely burn the inner walls of your small intestine, and that would be very painful for you. So when acidic chyme enters into the duodenum, it signals the enteroendocrine cells to release CCK and secretin. Those two enter the bloodstream. They go to the pancreas to tell the pancreas to produce both enzymes as well as bicarbonate. The pancreas will make the enzymes and the bicarbonate, and it will secrete it out right into the duodenum to mix with the acidic chyme to number 1, continue digestion, and number 2, to neutralize the space a little bit. Make sure you know the jobs of CCK and secretin, please. From the small intestine, This does not show you any of the small intestine, but it would be kind of sitting right in the middle here. Recap of the small intestine is the duodenum to the jejunum to the ileum. The ileum, it's right over here. It's showing you like a little bit of the cross section of that ileum. The ileum joins the first part of the large intestine at this region called the ileocecal junction. Just like all of the other digestive organs we talked about, there is a sphincter between the ileum and the large intestine. Remember, the large intestine also has the name colon. The bottom part of the colon, this right here, is called the cecum. So where the ileum and cecum come together, it's called the ileocecal junction. There is a sphincter here, and it is the ileocecal valve. They call it a valve, not a sphincter, but it acts just like a sphincter. Down at the bottom, that's your appendix. Yep, this little nugget that's hanging out right there doesn't really look like much, but when it's inflamed, it can be the size of a golf ball, even double that. But this is your appendix. So the ileum to the cecum starts moving up to make the ascending colon. The word ascending means going up. Across to the transverse colon, down the descending colon, across the sigmoid colon, through the rectum and the anus. These ridges are called haustrum, the word's right there. And all along, you're going to have these little patches over here. These are called epiploic patches. These epiploic patches, you don't need to know what they are. You just, I think it's on your list. If it's not, don't worry about it. But they're little pieces of tissue that hang off along the large intestine, and they help with the function of the large intestine, to help keep it balanced, to help keep it healthy, and to help get rid of pathogens. Make sure you know this illustration for your next lab exam. All right, so that was the digestive system anatomy. These illustrations that you see, of course, the ones that I mentioned, but even if I didn't mention it, if it's on the list and it's on the illustration, please expect it to be on your next lab practical. So if you have any questions on any of this material, please make sure to be emailing me or contacting me through Zoom or FaceTime. We can do that if you just let me know when, and we can go over anything you want to go over. Good luck on your lab practical tomorrow, and I will post your next lecture next week.